these lectures. All right, it's great to see all of you. Good morning. I hope you're having a fabulous morning. Welcome to the last formal lecture of the course. We did it. We got through 15 weeks of Zoom and classical political philosophy on Zoom. So that's heroic. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do three things. We're going to talk two things. We're going to talk about what is very loosely called the institutions of the republic, of the city that they're building. You could think of it in terms of the living arrangements of the guardians and why philosophers rule. So we're going to talk about two major things: the guardians, how they live, literally, and what their mode of life is. And we'll talk briefly at the end about philosopher kings and why philosopher kings rule. And that will conclude our reading of the Republic, and that will bring us to the end of the formal lectures for PS 411. So what I want to do is before we actually begin in book 5, let's go back to the end of book 3. All right, let's go back to page 95. Let's go back to the very end of book 3. And at the end of book 3, Plato had discussed the myth of the metals, the creation of the origin myth of the city that's being created. It's a poem, it's a lie, it's a noble lie, but it's necessary for the city, right? And then after they talked about the myth of the metals, Socrates started to discuss this extraordinarily controversial idea relating to how the guardians will live, what are the living arrangements of the guardian? What are the training arrangements for the guardians? What are the conditions concerning families and conditions concerning private property, right? What I loosely call the arrangements of the guardians. And this is an incredibly important part of the argument. And at the end of chapter 3, Socrates begins to discuss it, to open it up. And on page 95, first right in the middle of the page 95, first we get some observation about why the living arrangements and the condition and the issues of family and the issues of private property are so important. And then we talk about what they actually are. And right in the middle of page 95, at the end of chapter 3, Socrates writes, "Mustn't we in every way, we must do everything possible," Socrates says, "mustn't we in every way guard against the guardians doing anything like that to the citizens, since they are stronger than they, becoming like savage masters instead of well-meaning allies." And previously to that, they had talked about the problem of sort of people who possess power using their power to acquire the state, to acquire the wealth of the state, become tyrants, right? And again, this is a critical issue, right, for Plato. The guardians are the army. They are a special class of people who are specifically trained to go out and acquire the things that we want but don't need. And they also exist to ultimately control the laborers, to keep any laborer who wants to become a philosopher king or participate in politics from doing so. So the guardians are a critical part of the argument, and they constitute a potential threat to the order, right, to the moderation and to the stability of the city that's being built. Because at any given time, if some passion inside the guardians emerges that they want wealth, or they want power, or they want recognition, or they want private possessions, or as we will see even later, they want to travel. The guardians can't even leave this, they can't travel, right? If at any moment Plato is arguing that some passion, some desire, some urge for these sorts of things emerge inside the guardian class, this one is an extremely dangerous moment, and it sort of foreshadows potentially the ruination of the city itself. Because at the end of the day, if this passion emerges, if this desire emerges, if it grows and becomes strong, and ultimately maybe leads a guardian or leads a cabal of guardians, or the whole guardian class itself to simply say, we want power, or we want the wealth of the laborers, or we want the spice of the laborers, we want the power of the philosopher kings. If that should happen one day, nothing stops them from taking it, right? Right? They are the ones who know how to acquire and exercise violence, right? So they're extraordinarily dangerous. And so great, potentially impossible things have to be done to keep that urge from emerging, to make sure they're well educated, to make sure they're well trained, and to make sure they never forget their place. And so at the very bottom of 95, Socrates starts this discussion about the living arrangements, the institution generally of the guardian class, right? And the bottom of 95, Socrates says, well then, Socrates says, I said, see if this is the way they must live and be housed if they are going to be good guardians. First, no guardian, no one will possess any private property except for what's entirely necessary. Second, no one will have any private house or storeroom into which everyone who wishes cannot go. The sustenance, the pay that they get, the sustenance, as much as is needed by moderate and courageous men who are champions of war, they'll receive in fixed installments from other citizens, right? And later on, Socrates says they won't even get that. They'll just get food for what they do. In such quantity. Okay. Now, top of 96, all the guardians, they will go regularly to mess together. So they'll eat in common. They will regularly go to mess in common like soldiers in a camp and live a life in common. They'll live a life in common. And this is the famous communism of families and property that you often hear about in Plato's Republic. We will tell them, Socrates says, we will tell the guardians, we will tell them that gold and silver of a divine sort from the gods they have in their soul always. And they have no need for private property. They have no need for private families. They have no need for wealth and fame and families. So this is the beginning. Now, Socrates begins this conversation at the end of chapter 3, but as we saw on Tuesday, that conversation gets interrupted by Adeimantus at the beginning of book 4 saying, wait, Socrates, whoa, chill out. Adeimantus says, look, you don't seem to make these people happy. And then, of course, that's what got us onto the discussion on Tuesday about happiness. And then that took us into a search for the 4 elements of the ultimately the just city in this regard, right? And we went on a search for wisdom. We went on a search for courage. We went on a search for wisdom. And the chapter 4 ended up with a discussion of justice. Justice is what emerges when the 3 things are present. Wisdom in the philosopher kings, courage in the guardians, and a kind of moderation, which kind of harmonizes the parts and arranges the parts. And that's what justice was. Now, so after chapter 4 ends, then in chapter 5, they resume the conversation about the living arrangements for the guardians. right? So actually, in a strange way, chapter 5 should have been chapter 4, right? What we're about to do now, chapter 5, should have actually been chapter 4, but Adeimantus's question about happiness kind of diverted the discussion for a little way, and now we return to the issues raised at the end of chapter 3, but we are in book 5, and we are on now page 127. All right. And Adeimantus, again, at the end of book 4, there's the famous discussion of justice, and maybe there's this sense that the conversation is winding down. But Adeimantus, who is very, very aggressive in wanting to learn, says to Socrates at the bottom of page 127, right? Adeimantus is going to make sure that Socrates doesn't forget the part of the argument about the arrangements of the guardians, because it's so outrageous, right? It's extraordinary, right? And so on the bottom of page 127, Adeimantus says, in your opinion, in our opinion, Adeimantus says this to Socrates, right? He says, Socrates, in our opinion, you're taking it easy and robbing us of a whole section of the argument. What section? The part that they started to talk about at the end of book 3 about the arrangements, how the guardians live and what their family life is like, right? That's right. And you're robbing us of a whole section of the argument. And that not the least important, this seems to be the most important. So you won't have to go through it. And you suppose you'd get away with it by saying, as though it were something quite ordinary, that after all, it's plain to everybody that as for women and children and the things of friends, everything will be in common, right? So now we're going to have a discussion about the living arrangements of the guardians. How do they actually live? Okay, we've already talked about how they're educated, right? In poetry and in music. Now we have to discuss how they live. How do they actually live? And there's kind of three parts. One, they train in common. 2, they have families in common. And 3, they do not possess any private property. They do not possess any private property. Now, before we go back to the book to give little examples of each one of these things and talk about them, let me just contextualize this, right? Again, why is this important? Right? Why is this important? At the end of the day, in addition to the noble lies we tell the guardians, in addition to the music we only let them hear, why do they live in this way? Right? And in addition to what we just said earlier, one, because they possess this extraordinary power, and if they ever want to acquire power or acquire the wealth, they can do so, nothing stopping them. And 2, also to the arrangements of the guardians from Plato's kind of pessimistic point of view, finally solves 2 or 3 of the biggest problems we have been following throughout the first lecture. Right? And remember, I said a long time ago, it feels like 100 years ago, when we first started this semester, we're going to see a series of problems and issues in the Antigone. And we're going to see these issues show up not just in the Antigone, we're going to see them show up in the Euthyphro, we're going to see them show up in the Apology, we're going to see them show up in the Crito. We even saw them show up at the beginning of the Republic in Book 1 with respect to the different claims to justice that we saw by Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. And 2 of those major issues that we saw in the Antigone and that we still have to deal with, right? Because they have significant implications for the stability of the city, right? Right. The way the guardians live, the arrangements of the guardian class, is done in a way to finally solve for Plato. And again, in an extraordinarily dramatic way, right? What they are proposing may not even be possible, but this is what would have to be done if the city's going to be stable, if this feverish city is going to be stable. And the arrangements of the guardians that they train together, men and women, that they have families in common. The guardians have no private children. The children are all the children of the guardian class. And that they have no private property. They possess nothing. As Socrates gestured to at the end of book 3, they have no rooms. They have no private rooms. They don't have little dressers next to their beds where they can lock. There's nothing there. They have no private property. They have no private possessions. Right? And you think, God, this is extraordinarily drastic. Why is Plato doing this? And at the end of the day, it's done to solve two of the most serious of all political issues. That we saw in the Antigone, and that we're finally still dealing with in the Republic, right? So these arrangements that we just talked about, they train together, families in common, no private property. These arrangements, how they live, are necessary to solve two of the most difficult problems we have encountered throughout the class, from the Antigone to the Republic. And these problems are: one, first, the tension, right, between loyalty to the city or loyalty to one's family, right? And of course, there's two parts of that, right? One, there's tension between the family and the city, right? And there's tension between, at the end of the day, does one's loyalty belong to the family, or does one's loyalty belong to the city, right? And of course, we saw that in the Antigone. There was a crisis inside the family, right, about who rules, right? That crisis inside the family about who rules ended up creating a war. The two brothers fought, so this became a loyalty to the family, a loyalty to the city problem, and this precipitated the crisis in the Antigone, right? We saw this issue in the Euthyphro. There's a crisis. Euthyphro is about to do something extraordinarily dangerous to his family because of what he thinks he knows, right? And of course, Crito. The first thing Crito says when Crito comes to save Socrates, man, to hell with the city. You got an obligation to save yourself and protect your family. Fuck the city, right? Let's go. Right, let's go. So the arrangements of the guardians, that they train together, that they have no private families, right, and they have no private possessions, is intended to solve in the guardian class the first of these major issues. This to loyalty to the city or loyalty to the family. And then two, the second of these major issue is the problem of truly knowing who your friends are and who your enemies are, right? Right. The guardians can never, ever, 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 ever mistake who their friends are and who their enemies are, right? And by the way, coming to mistake those things, right? Errors about who your friends are and who your enemies are in some ways the roots of a lot of personal and political crisis. So the arrangements of the guardians are designed to solve two problems, right? The problem that emerges between loyalty to one's family and loyalty to one's city, and problems associated with who are your friends and who are your enemies, right? And Plato solves both of these problems in an extraordinarily dramatic way by doing two things with respect to how the guardians live. One, there are no private families in the guardians, so they don't have families. In fact, the city is their family, right? For the guardians, there can never be confusion about loyalty to the family or loyalty to the city, because they have no families. The city becomes their family, right? And the guardians, the city is the family. And two, right? There's never any concern about who their friends are and who their enemies are. One, because they train together, they live together, they raise children together, they have no private property, and they serve the city. City is their friend. Maintaining the order of the city is what they're supposed to do. All right, so let's go. Page 128, bottom of page 128. Glaucon says, all right, Socrates, let's get to work. Let's talk about the arrangements of the guardians. Glaucon says, look, Socrates, right? People are going to ask what the community, this is towards the bottom of page 128, what the community of children and women will be among our guardians, right? How will they live? What will their family structure be, right? What the community of children and women will be among our guardians. And their rearing, right? How will the children be reared when they are still young? In the time between birth and education, which seems to be the most trying. Right, so let's talk about that. Okay. Bottom of 129. Bottom of 129. Socrates says, very bottom. First, and first they're going to talk about the training. First, we're going to talk about how the guardians will train together. First, we're going to talk about training, then we're going to talk about families, and then we're going to talk about possessions, no private possessions. So on the bottom of 129, the discussion about training begins, right? And again, remember that the language is very intense, right? Socrates says, because there's everybody who's listening to this is kind of shocked, right? About how radical this is. This is what is about to be proposed is radical, right? In fact, it's so radical, it may not be possible. And we'll talk about that right at the end, okay? But at the bottom of page 129, Socrates says, look, we've got to be fierce in the argument. We can't flinch. We set up these postulates and we've got to follow them through. And he says, all right. He says, like this, Socrates says, talking about training. And by the way, if in the Republic, I suppose Plato is one of the first feminists in Western philosophy, because male guardians and female guardians will train. There are female guardians. There are female warriors, right? It's not the guardians. The guardian class is not just made up of men. It's not a exclusively male class. It's a class, and the class structure is determined by one's nature. You are in the ruling class because you have gold in your soul. You are in the guardian class because you have silver in your soul, and you are in the laboring class because you have bronze in your soul. And so if you're in the guardian class and there's men and women, and what they have in common is their natures. Remember, as we said, that's Plato's notion of specialization. And so Socrates is following this out to its kind of brutal logical conclusion. So in the guardian class, you're going to have men and women because they have the same natures, right? They have the kind of silver in their souls. They have the same natures. And Socrates says, do we believe the females of the guardian dogs, and again, that word is used again, extraordinary, right? Do we believe the females of the guardian dogs must guard the things the males guard along with them and hunt with them and do the rest in common, right? Or must they stay indoors as though they were incapacitated as a result of bearing and rearing puppies, right? So again, that kind of analogy, the guardians are noble dogs. They're noble dogs. And when you train noble dogs, you train the females and the males in the same way. And this sort of the brutal logic of this metaphor and this analogy about natures is gonna play out to its extreme conclusion. And and Glaucon says, well, okay, so there's going to be female guardians, but Glaucon says, but surely we'll give them less dangerous things to do, or less difficult things to do, something like that. And Socrates says, no. On the top of page 130, he says, no. Right? Socrates says, is it possible, I say, Socrates, to use any animal, any nature? Is it possible to use any nature for the same thing if you don't assign it the same rearing and education? So Socrates says, no. There's going to be male guardians, there's going to be female guardians, they're going to be trained exactly the same. They're going to be reared, they're going to be educated, and they're going to be trained in exactly the same way. And he's talking about physical training, right? He's talking about physical training. And so he says, is it possible? Socrates says, is it possible to use any nature for the same thing if you don't assign it the same rearing and education? And Glaucon says, no, you're right, Socrates, it's not possible. And Socrates says, then, okay, then we use the women guardians for the same things as the men. They must also be taught the same things, right? And by the way, it took America, what, 3,000 years after this was written, to finally let women into the special forces, right? There was a big argument in the last several years about women wanting to be allowed to join the special forces training program. And for a very long time, they were excluded, only males in the special forces, various special forces elements of the US military, but now they're in. So this is what Socrates is talking about. Women will be in the special forces, right? And they will live alongside the men. They will be trained alongside the men. There will be no different treatment for the guardians based on gender. There will be no special treatment or different modes of training for the guardians based on gender. Again, so in some ways, this is a kind of a radical gender equalitarian argument, right? Plato is the first. And by the way, as we'll see later, it's the same with the philosopher kings. There are philosopher queens. In fact, it's a misnomer to say philosopher kings. It should say philosopher rulers, because there are both men and women that are part of the ruling class, the philosopher class, because there's all sorts of, just your nature. It doesn't matter. Your nature determines what you do, not your gender, for Plato. Your nature determines what you do, not the gender, right? So for Plato, there are female guardians and there are female philosopher rulers. All right, so Socrates says, then we must use the women for the same things as the men. They must also be taught the same things, right? And Glaucon said, yeah, okay. And of course they talked, so the music and the gymnastics were given to the guardians. And Socrates says, these two arts, the education, the poetry, the music that they learned earlier in books 2 and 3, and the gymnastics. Now we're talking about the training. These two arts and what has to do with war must be assigned to the women also. And they must be used in the same way. All right. So they're going to be trained exactly the same way. Now, on the rest of the page, there's a kind of a joke that is made about, how awkward it's going to be to see men and women naked training, because they're going to train naked. That is kind of the custom, right? They're training and they're working out, and they either did it very lightly clothed or they did it completely naked. And there's a kind of joke that happens about how awkward that's going to be at first. And then the conversation continues. And we go to page bottom of 134. there's some back and forth about the training. And then on the bottom of page 134, 456b, Socrates writes, such women, these women in the guardians, must also be chosen to live and guard with the men, since they are competent and akin to men in their natures, right? So they train together, they're going to live together, they receive the same education, they receive the same training, and they live together as equals. And as Plato says, what determines this is their nature and not their gender. And this is what he means. So women, therefore, must also be chosen to live and guard with guardian men, since they are competent and akin to men in their natures. That's what that Socrates uses that word, their natures. And then Adeimantus or Glaucon agrees, and Socrates says, and mustn't the same practices be assigned to same natures? Yes. So there's total equality in the guardian class between men and women with respect to education and training. And then finally, after they talk about how this is going to happen a little bit, on the bottom of page 135, Socrates says, then it's settled. Then the women guardians must strip, since they'll clothe themselves in virtue instead of robes. And they must take common part in war and the rest of the city's guardians, and must not do other things. All right, so there you go. The guardian class is made up of men and women. There is no difference in roles, in activities, in expectations between the men and the women based on gender. And women will fight alongside men in war. They're female guardians. All right, so they're trained together. All right, let's turn to the family. Bottom of 136. Right now we're turning from the training to the family. All right, and right in the middle of page 136, Socrates says, again, we're off the training, now we're transitioning into the families. And Socrates says, all of these women are to belong to all of these men in common. And no woman is to live privately with any man. And the children, in their turn, will be in common. And neither will a parent know his own offspring, nor a child his parent. All right, so this is the beginning of this idea that families are in common, right? And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about how they're going to deal with arranged marriages. But the idea here is that the private family unit inside the guardian class has been dissolved. The private family unit inside the guardian class has been dissolved. Doesn't exist anymore. It can't exist. Right, and what's going to happen is, again, we'll say a little bit about this in a second, but they're going to contrive to arrange marriages. They're going to create more noble lives to create these sort of contests and these sort of celebrations where they arrange marriages, they arrange sexual intercourse, they regulate it, they breed. The philosopher rulers will arrange marriages, will arrange sexual intercourse, they will breed. The eugenics project. And they will take the children from them and they will raise them in common. So as best as humanly possible, no guardian, no female or male guardian will know his or her child. And when a female or a male guardian says son or daughter, 1,000 voices respond. Or when a guardian child says father or mother, 1,000 voices respond. The guardian class is one family. And if and I use that loosely in a sense, they have children and families in common. And if the guardians have a family in that traditional sense, it's the city. The city is the family, right? The city itself. The loyalty is to, if for the guardians, if you wanted to speak about the loyalty to the family or the loyalty to the city, as we said earlier, there is no family. The loyalty, the city is the family. Plato has dissolved the private family structure inside the guardian class. There's no private family. Wives, not even wives, women and children, children and men, however you want to speak about the arrangements, they are all held in common. There is no private family. When a child says mother, 1,000 female voices respond. When a guardian child says father, 1,000 male voices respond. Right? And so Socrates says, all these women are to belong to all these men in common. And no woman, or no man is to live with a woman. No woman is to live with a man, or man with a woman. And no woman is to live privately with any man. And the children, in their turn, will be in common. And neither will a parent know his own offspring, nor a child his parents. And again, this is to kind of break the problem you found in the Antigone. It's to break the problem you found in the Crito, right? Crito says to Socrates, fuck the city, right? You got to take care of first of all, you got to take care of yourself, and then you got to take care of your family, and then you got to take care of your bros, right? Your loyalty, Crito says to Socrates, right? And Crito was a friend of Socrates, right? Crito was an aristocrat. Crito says, man, your loyalty is your loyalties to yourself, your loyalties to your kids. Remember, Crito says, hey, save your kids. If you're not going to save yourself, save your family, save your kids. And then think of your friends. This is what friendship is for Crito. Right? And so the dissolving of the private family structure inside the guardian class is designed to break this problem. The city is the family for the guardians. All the children are in common. All right. And so again, they go on, middle of page 137. No private families. They have common houses. They eat together. No one privately possessing anything of the kind. And again, we'll pick this up in a few minutes, okay? But this kind of shows up there. All right. Now, a few words about this, just because it's fascinating. It's intense. On the bottom of page 137, there's a pretty long discussion about how they're going to do this, right? I mean, you got all these, look, they're training together, they're training naked together, they've got these sexual urges. How the hell do you deal with all of these things? How do you keep the urges? How do you keep them from having sex unregulated, right? So you don't have too many children, right, in the guardian class, and that becomes a problem. And so the response that Plato gives is arranged marriages, right? And on the bottom of page 137, Socrates writes, then it's plain, right? Socrates says, then it's plain that next we'll make marriages sacred in the highest possible degree, and the most beneficial marriages would be sacred, right? So again, so the philosopher rulers, the philosopher kings and queens, are going to have to, in addition to the myth of the metals, are going to have to create all of these other sacred myths, these sacred stories, these sacred poems that seem to justify the arrangement of marriages and the arrangement of sexual intercourse for the bearing of guardian children, right? Because you can't just have the guardians hooking up when they want, right? That's a problem. And so again, middle of page 138 towards the bottom. And they're talking about the arranged marriages. And 3/4 of the way down, right, Socrates says it's likely, again, it's likely that our rulers, the philosopher kings and queens, it's likely that our rulers will have to use a throng of lies and deceptions for the benefit of the ruled, right? A whole nother series of lies, noble lies, that come in the form of sacred poems, sacred myths, right? From the gods, right? That explain and justify the arrangements of marriages, the arrangements of intercourse. Now, again, these are things that the guardians believe to be true, but of course they're myths, they're noble lies. They've been concocted by the philosopher rulers, right? It is likely that the rulers will have to use a throng of lies and deceptions for the benefit of the ruled. And of course, we said that everything of this sort is useful as a form of remedy. Again, there's that word. The noble lies are useful as a form of remedy, as salve, right? And remedy for what? Salve for what? The potential wound in the soul. And the potential wound in the soul at this stage of the argument for the guardians is the urge to have a private family, is the urge to have private children, is the urge to follow one's sexual desires and make love with people whenever one wants, right? This disruption of the passions, right? The wanting, the desiring of things we want but do not need, right? Which, by the way, begins the process of destabilizing the order of the soul. That becomes the wound. The noble lie is the remedy for the wound. The salve, the salutary myth, the noble lie, the salutary myth, the myth that is good, the myth that heals, the remedy. It's likely that our rulers will have to use a throng of lies and deceptions for the benefit of the ruled, for the guardians, and also too for the laborers. The laborers, they believe the myth of the metals, they believe the state religion. And of course, we said that everything of this sort is useful as a sort of remedy. And Glaucon says, yeah, we were right to say that. Now it seems it is not the least in marriages and procreation. So they talk about 138, 139, how they're going to conduct a kind of breeding program among the guardians. They're going to arrange the marriages, and they're going to arrange this thing that the best male guardians and the best female guardians have sex, and they're going to do it like it's a lottery, but it's contrived. All right, now let's go to page 141. And let's move on to possessions. So we've talked about the training, we've talked about the families, and now we'll talk about this idea that for the guardians, they can possess no private possessions, nothing. And not just that they can't possess private possessions, there's nowhere in the guardian class where you could go where there would be something hidden from other guardians. There's no drawers, there's no closets, there's nothing of that sort. Right in the middle of page 141. Have we any greater evil for a city? Have we any greater evil for a city than what splits it and makes it many instead of one? Or a greater good than what binds it together and makes it one? Right? And this is the question of private possessions, and this is the question of money. Right? Earlier, I think it was, where was it? It was earlier. Yeah, it was back in chapter 4, where there was that famous passage by Plato, when he's talking about really all cities that exist are really two cities. There's the rich and the poor, and there's two cities inside, and they are at war with each other. That the competition for wealth and the competition for possession destroys cities. In fact, this is one of the deep cancers of politics. One of the primary origins of political crisis is money, is the desire for money, it's the desire for wealth, it's the desire for acquisition, and we're living it right now, where you just have to look out the window right now, right? And so now they're talking about possession. So 2 lines down, and they're talking about money, they're talking about private possession. And Socrates says, but the privacy of such things dissolves the city. When some are overwhelmed and other overjoyed by the same things happening in the city and those within the city. Right? Is then that city in which most say my own and not my own about the same thing, and in the same way, the best governed city? So for the guardians, there can be no private possessions, because there can't be any attachment to wealth. There can't be, you can't own anything that could be a source of value, right? And such that could become more important to you than the city, or that you would want what other people have. Right? You can possess nothing. Right? No private possessions, no homes, no jewelry, no clothes, no shoes, all the sort of things that we think of as private possessions. In the guardian class, there will be no private possessions. So on the bottom of page 143, and then Socrates says, we also agree with what went before. For we were saying, of course, that there mustn't be private houses for them, nor land, nor any possessions. Instead, they must get their livelihood from the others as a wage for guarding, and use it up in common altogether if they are really going to be guardians. Okay? So, for the guardians, they train together. There's absolute equality between men and women in the guardian class with respect to training. Women guardians are trained exactly the same way, and they live and die exactly the same way. There are no families. There are no private families in the guardian class. Plato dissolves the family structure. So the city becomes the family. The city is the family. So the loyalty to the guardians is not to their children or to their spouses. Their loyalty is to the city. The city is their family. There are no private children. So there's no personal attachments of one over the other, or protecting one's children over the benefit or the expectations of the city, or advancing the interests of one's family or one's children over the well-being of the city. It's dissolved. There are no private possessions. There's nothing that you can say, this is mine. There's no homes, there's no jewelry, there's no gold, there's no savings accounts, there's no cars, there's no clothes, there's no bling in the guardian class. They receive food and I guess some compensation, which I guess they use to keep up the barracks. Now, we have said, or we did say, and we've been suggesting as we've been reading the Republic, that in many ways, the Republic is meant to be read ironically. Right? The book is meant to be read ironically. And by that I mean that the city that is actually built, that we've just built, is not Plato's vision for a real city. Right? The city that has been built is not Plato's literal vision of a just city. The book is meant to be read ironically. It's meant to be read as a kind of cautionary tale. What would you have to do to human beings in order to maintain in a kind of a stable and moderate way a feverish city? What you'd have to do would be so extraordinary and so extreme, it's probably not even existentially possible. So the Republic is meant to be read ironically. It's a cautionary tale. And some insight to this is on page 128. So let's go back to the beginning of book 5. Some insight to this is on page 128. And they're just starting to get into how intense the education and the training of the guardians is, how radical the dissolution of the family really is, how radical the dissolution of ownership of private property it is. This is extreme, this is extraordinary. And it's so extreme and it's so extraordinary, two questions are raised, right? One, is this even possible? Could you even do this to human beings? And 2, the second question, even if you could, would you? Right? Would you? And these 2 questions again raise the question of whether we should read the Republic ironically or literally. And this passage suggests we need to read it ironically. So Socrates says, because they're preparing for the 3 waves, they call it in chapter 5, these very extreme arrangements of the guardian's life. And Socrates says, you're right, this is an issue. He says it's not easy to go through, you happy man. He's talking to Adeimantus or Glaucon, right? Because Glaucon and Adeimantus are starting to raise questions about how radical this is. All right, Socrates says, you're right. You're absolutely fucking right. It's not easy to go through. I said, even more than that. This is the bottom of page 128. Even more, Socrates says. It's not just that it's hard to go through. Even more than what we went through before. It admits of many doubts. 4, it could be doubted. It could be doubted that the things said are possible. Is it really possible to eviscerate the emotions of the guardians in their education? Is it really possible to dissolve the family structure? Is it really possible to dissolve one's attachment to private possessions? I mean, think about it, man. What must you do to human beings in order to maintain the stability of the feverish city? Right? Even more than what we went before, it admits of many doubts. For it could be doubted that the things said are possible. And even if they are possible in the best possible conditions, they could come into being. That they would be what is best is also doubted. So that is why there's a certain hesitation in getting involved in it. for fear that the argument might seem to be a prayer, my dear comrades. All right. Again, so again, they're fully aware of what they're doing and the difficulties associated with it. And therefore, there's some suggestion that the city that they've created is a kind of ironical city. It's designed to serve as a cautionary tale. Now, here's the key. While the city that they have created is intended to be ironical, it's probably not actually possible to do this to human beings. And even if it were, we probably fucking shouldn't. So it's a cautionary tale. It's an ironical tale. Right? And it's the saying of one thing with the intention of another. So if the tale is ironical, if the saying of one thing, the building of this city, is ironical, the saying of one thing with the intention of another, what's the intention? What's the intention? While the city is ironical, it's probably not possible. And even if it were possible, we probably shouldn't do this to human beings. While the city is not possible, the movement of the city is possible for the individual soul. At the individual level, at the level of the individual soul, the Republic is not ironical. You and I have this kind of obligation to recognize that we are rational creatures, that reason is a special faculty unique to human beings that is connected to some objective truth about our own natures and essential concepts. And we have a moral responsibility and obligation to acquire as much knowledge as we can about that in the process of educating or becoming educated. And a critical part of that becoming educated is learning to control our passions, learning to control first, before we control the passions, learning to control our vital energy, right? Our vital energy that moves us, right? We have this vital energy in life. And is that vital energy going to be moved to superior things, or is that vital energy going to be directed to the purpose of inferior things? How is this what Plato called spirit earlier, what in the city is called the guardians? And so we are rational creatures. We are led by the superior part of our existence. We use that to train and educate our energy, our spirit, what in the city we're called the guardians. We create an alliance between our reason and our vital energy and moderation, and we use it to control the passions. So while the city is ironical because it's probably not possible to do it, at the level of the individual soul, it's literal. The well-ordered soul, you are self-governing. You become self-governing. You are no longer Euthyphro. You are no longer Miletus. You are no longer Crito. You become self-governing when you order your soul. And that is potential for every person at some fundamental level. Now, in book 7, Plato finishes, at least for us, Plato finishes with this discussion of why philosophers rule. Why do philosophers rule? And there are two reasons, core reasons. One, obviously, because they've spent 50 years of their life before the philosopher rulers actually participate in the governance of the city. They've spent 50 years thinking deeply about the essential things, about justice, about courage, about friendship, about moderation, love. They spent 50 years reflecting on the essential concepts. And they've acquired as much as they can, in the capacity that they can, knowledge about those things. So they have knowledge, right? Of course, obviously. But two, the philosophers rule too, because not only do they have knowledge about ruling, but they are the only people who don't want to rule. The philosophers can be trusted with power because they don't want it, right? What do they want to do? They want to just think. All really, in the most abstract sense, the philosophical life is just a life of reflection. It's a life of philosophical and intellectual reflection. At the end of the day, the last thing the philosophers want to do is rule. But they feel compelled to as part of their obligation to the city. We have a moral obligation to give our knowledge and our talents to the city. So the philosopher kings rule, one, because they possess the knowledge of the essential concepts. Two, because they don't want to rule. The last thing they want to do is rule. So you can trust them with power because they don't want it. And they rule out of their moral obligation to others. They rule out of a moral obligation to others, to help others keep from destroying themselves and destroying the city. And three, the philosopher rulers, the philosopher kings and queens, have an understanding of the whole. They understand how the whole fits together. The guardians only see the guardian part. And they understand the whole because of the myth of the metals, but they only see the guardian part. The laborers, they understand the whole through the lie, through the myth of the metals, but they only see the labor part. Only the philosopher kings and queens see the whole and see how the whole is arranged and have the knowledge about the whole and how to arrange the whole to keep it stable in that way. All right. I cannot express to you what a fucking joy it has been to spend the last 15 weeks with you, even on Zoom. This has just been an extraordinary experience for me. My love for all of you is absolutely unconditional and infinite. And I just want to thank you for really an extraordinary intellectual and human experience, even under the most extraordinary and trying times. I'm so damn proud of all of you. I'm proud that you show up. I'm proud of the questions. I'm proud of the midterms and the work you're doing and the love that we've created, even in Zoom, even in this kind of this digital age. It's just extraordinary to me. And I just want to thank you. And I just want to from one soul to a whole bunch of other souls, love and gratitude. So this completes the formal lectures for the course. Next Tuesday will be a review session. It is not mandatory. If you don't want to show up, you want to take that time to work on the final, do it. If you want to pop in and ask a question, do it. I'll be here, probably drinking some whiskey. So, thank you. Much love to all of you. I wish you and your families health and safety and joy. All right. See if you want to come to the review next Tuesday, it'll be here same time. All right. Ciao.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.